I had a great time at the Willard Clock Museum in Grafton, Massachusetts. Now it's time to put some of those sketches that I did on location to good use. I got a chance to see some light and some conditions that I wouldn't see from a photograph, but I'm going to take those thumbnails as well as a photograph and see if I can do a painting and a drawing right here. Now my first thumbnail sketch that I did on location, I roughed out that thumbnail style box that would replicate an 8x10 or 9x12, but what I found on site is essentially when I picked my view, I was looking at a wider scene than tall. So initially with my gate that I had here on the left, I didn't find room for it on the right. I then switched over the next time I rendered it and replicated the fact that I have a gate here and a gate here and these long shadows that might kind of lead me into my scene. Proceeding forward to my watercolor version now, I essentially showcased that as well with the two gates right here, these long shadows, the contrast of light and darks, and I thought, at least on location, I was ready to go back to my studio and finish the artwork. And that's what I've done. I've returned back to my studio and I've taken a piece of illustration board and an H pencil, which I will show you what that means. That's a 2H pencil. I use that when I'm working on artwork like this, where I don't want my pencil lines to show through. And I've already done my pencil sketch utilizing these sketches that I've done previously in my now knowledge of the location. I've worked it out on an 8 inches tall by 20 inches wide piece of illustration board. And the nice thing about an illustration board versus watercolor paper is it will accommodate the wash of watercolor I plan on putting down, as well as some pen and ink. It's kind of a mixed media, does it almost everything perfect. So I thought that might be a good use. But I now have some choices. The choices are, do I do an entire ink drawing and then put some paint on top of my ink lines? Or do I do some watercolor wash down first and then do my ink on top of the watercolor? So I think that might be a nice time to now show you what the pro and con of that might be. I've sketched out, just for example, two little Willard Clock Museum fronts here. The first being, I'm going to render it in ink, and then I'm going to add a slight little watercolor wash to it. Okay. Again, a wash would be, it's going to be more water than paint. Here's a little permanent rose in the front of it. And then as I touch the side of the building, I've added in a little Prussian blue into the same color. It's just the effect, just like I did with my monochromatic painting outside, just a little bit of suggestion on color. It's not a full watercolor that I'm worried about capturing every single detail with the watercolor. It's just to accentuate colors. Okay, so there's a quick little watercolor wash on top of ink. Now I've done a pencil sketch of the same view of the clock museum here, and this idea would be to do the painting first and then do the inking. So I'm going to have to paint this and then layer ink on top of it. I'm going to now let it dry. My second version is now dry to the touch right here. And now what I can start doing is inking on top of it. And the reason why I want to showcase that these two approaches might be completely different is based on the fact that when you're using ink, whether it be with a micron pen or a dipping pen or even a brush, and you're working on top of a medium, and like in this case it would be watercolor, there's going to be a drag or resistance because you're, instead of being on top of the paper surface, you're on top of a paint. Now, as I'm going to be doing this watercolor wash, I am going to be utilizing transparent paints. Now, transparents are very thin, and then I'm going to thin them down even more by using excessive water. So I can work on top of my paint here with little fear that it's going to kind of, for lack of a better term, gum up my pen tip. But that is a concern when you are working with pen and ink and you're introducing a water, that if you're working with the ink on top of it, if this paint was more opaque, it would actually build up and pill and pile, and it would suddenly become an issue for the long term. I believe, at least in this case, that I can do both versions of this with no issues. If you look closely, you can start to see that there's no residual buildup of ink on top of that paint. Had it been a different kind of paint, there would be trouble. But please keep that in mind when you're doing pen and ink and you're going to introduce a color. If it's watercolor, keep in mind how thick the paint itself is and lean towards using more water and less paint. Now my decision is, as I move forward, how am I going to apply what I've just learned to my final painting? I believe, and what I'll probably do is in the background trees right here, I might drop in the colors first, suggested spot colors, and then what'll happen is little spots of location on the illustration board that don't get paint on top of them, I can kind of put in little elements and showcase little branches in those trees. So in other words, less paint will help me paint the trees. Whereas with the actual Willard clock right here itself, I'll probably do a pen and ink first and then add paint on top of it. It's just two different approaches. It might not seem obvious that it's a big difference, but it is a big difference dependent on the paint and when you're working on top of it with a pen. Well, I'm jumping into my painting, and I typically would work light to dark when I'm doing a watercolor, so that's not going to change right now. But what I would be changing now is how I'm applying the colors. There is a lot of water in my mixture, and I'm also going to be doing more of my pressing in the brush. This is a round brush with the heel of it. I'm trying to literally almost create texture in my strokes. Not trying to manipulate a brush, the leaves or the branches, just articulate the fact that there's a texture going on, which is a texture is also something I'm going to carry through when I start doing the pen and ink. So there's my little bit of yellow. Now I might start adding in a little bit of green on top of it. And again, as I'm using that heel of the brush, it's starting to splay out and almost become what would foliage look like at a distance. And I'll just keep doing that. I'm going to try not to overpaint it, because I am also going to be doing some ink in the background and I don't want to overwhelm it. When I started to do some inking and I had some options to do, at first I could go for a dipping pen, dip it right into a bottle of ink and have a varied line, which is something I will consider doing at some point, or use my micron pens. Now these are technical pens. They are waterproof. They work out well with mixed media like this. They come in different sizes, from an 0.5, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. Each has a varying thickness on it. And the lines I've done so far is I've been using a 1 point. Here's the tip. And as I start to sketch out just suggested lines here for the different tree branches I'm seeing in the background, I want to make sure that my background tree line doesn't interfere with the middle ground or the Willard Clock Museum and the contrasting colors. If I go too much detail in the background, it'll take away what's happening in the middle. So I'm just suggested little branches here and there. Of course, way off in the distance, you're not going to see a lot of detail anyways. But some vertical lines, broken lines. I talked about texture. This is a spot to add some texture. But as the branches reach up for the sky, I'm also complementing what I've already done with the part of the watercolor wash. As little opportunities arise with the white spots, kind of accentuate that as a highlight. So just, again, opportune moments when you put down a wash to purpose. The little mistakes that might have happened in the wash can now become a highlight in the part of the inking. Now I'm going to move on to rendering the Clock Museum. Well, apologies, I was filming this side and it didn't come out, so I'm just going to replicate what I was talking about on this side of my fence post that are closer to the viewer. Now, going back to my process of further back, minimal detail in the middle ground, a lot of textural detail to showcase that. I feel if I was to do my gate and rock scene here and have it the same look as this or that, it would get confusing and lay flat. So I've opted to use a liner brush here, and I probably may come in at the end and use my dip and pen as mentioned previously, but I really want to showcase that this is here, there's there, there's, and that is in the background. And the best way to do that is me to use my liquid ink. I've placed it simply inside my little palette here. And when I go to place my line work here, I'm thinking initially for the rocks in the background to replicate more of a textural dry brush look. So I'm going to smash the side of my brush into the surface of the illustration board. And that, using the side of my brush, is going to allow the bristles to kind of splay out and immediately create a texture effect that it would take me a long time to replicate with my micron. So again, practice makes perfect, and use a little piece of paper towel and a test piece of paper. And when you feel comfortable, just think about what rock forms that you're creating here and a few boulders, and then you can come back in at the end and add detail. Now, as far as my fence post here, I like to say that nothing in nature is straight. And I think even a piece of cut wood, even though created in a bandsaw nice and straight, to build a building or a fence, case a fence post, it technically is straight. I think a shaky hand is perfectly fine. So the shaky hand approach is going to suffice here. If those lines aren't straight, I'm not going to pull out a ruler. A few more little rocks here. As I get down here in my cast shadows, again, as the ink kind of flows out of the brush, start to do a little bit of scrub brush technique here. I use the tip of the brush, a little textural effect, hatching, just to replicate what we have over here with a cast shadow. Just trying to be free and loose and spontaneous and showcase that there's different depths happening here, and that the thicker line is going to allow me to show that. Well, I think it's about time to do my best to wrap this up at this point and continue my wash. I've looked at now that I have most of the inking done, I'd like to just add in the subtle details here, not a lot of color, but I've put into my palette here some alizarin crimson, as well as some indanthrene blue. That's going to be my combination of my light color and dark color on the side on the light side and the cast shadow side of my buildings. And then I'll mix them together again to get some halftone. I'll then add them together and wash them out and put in my concrete here, and then a little bit more green to replicate the background, and I'll be done. So I've taken my number 10 round brush here, and I'm off and running. Again, where the light was coming in here to the scene, I really want to be adamant about thinking that this side is towards the light with a shaky hand. And then, so that would be the front side of the Willard Clock Museum. Maybe a few touches right here. I was trying to be opposite of my cross hatching here. So it's, and then the front side of the barn. Really replicate the fact that this is closer to light, and then everything else on the opposite side will be nice and dark, or darker. And that should create the depth of detail in what could potentially be a flat area. The fun thing about any sort of painting outside, inside, or in general is to chase the light. So that's the fun part for me, right? This is when all this effort is coming together, and I'm looking forward to finishing this up. I'm using a little bit kind of tap along one brush. I'm not trying to be particular and fill in each void like I'm coloring it in. I want these little wet speckles here to showcase through. That's going to give it more of a uniform look, so to speak, between a few different color combinations. Well, I finished up my pen and ink and watercolor wash of that Willard Clock Museum in Grafton, Massachusetts. Being on site allowed me to learn a lot of things that I wouldn't have seen had I just worked my photograph. So getting there and sketching, looking at the light, observing the location and all its different angles, really hopefully came out for a better piece. I hope you get a chance to get out there and do some painting and drawing yourself. And I'd like to thank the Blackstone Valley Art Association as well as the Willard Clock Museum for allowing me to come on site. So get out there and do some drawing and painting. And as I like to say, yay art.